Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we are strapping in for a high-altitude conceptual flight, a doctrine deep dive dedicated entirely to mapping out the core concepts and the often tumultuous evolution of air power theory.
It's essential stuff.
It really is. For anyone looking to understand why military thought evolved so drastically in the 20th century, this is, it's foundational material.
It's absolutely right. What we're tracing here is perhaps one of the most fundamental shifts in the history of warfare, one that happened in just a few decades.
Right.
We're looking at how the airplane transitioned in the theoretical discussion from just an auxiliary device, something for reconnaissance or spotting artillery fire.
A tool for the Army.
The tool for the Army, exactly. To what its proponents insisted was the ultimately decisive weapon of modern conflict.
And to guide this exploration, we've synthesized some foundational works that really span a century of strategic thinking, and we've pulled out the most vital arguments.
Yeah, and we should probably mention our primary sources up front.
Good idea. We're drawing from Giulio Douhet's foundational text, Command of the Air, extensive and frankly crucial excerpts from David Faber's analysis in The Paths of Heaven, and also Jonathan Glover's powerful ethical examination, Humanity, a moral history of the 20th century.
So our mission today really is to answer this pressing and very complicated question that links the historical past to the strategic present.
Okay.
How did these early, often fanatical or radical visions of air war,
visions that proposed bypassing armies entirely and attacking civilian populations directly.
Exactly. How did those ideas become the accepted operational and even moral realities of modern conflict? We need to look really closely at the gap between that vision and the often inadequate technology at the time.
And the ethical compromises that were made along the way.
That's the heart of it.
Okay, let's start where the idea of modern independent air power theory truly begins, with the radical Italian theorist Giulio Douhet. His context is absolutely crucial for understanding just how radical he was. He was writing in the wake of the First World War.
That experience fundamentally shaped everything he thought. He had just observed the grinding, static, attritional character of land warfare during that conflict.
Trenches.
The trenches, those endless lines, continuous fronts, and the way modern firearms, particularly the machine gun and rapid-fire artillery, just heavily favored the defensive.
The sheer cost in lives, in material, just to move the front lines a few miles was obscene.
Douhet saw the war not just as a tragedy, but as a strategic failure. A crippling, frustrating, and incredibly costly stalemate, where any offensive success required this overwhelming preponderance of force.
Which, of course, led inevitably to the slaughter of thousands, as he put it.
Right. And from that, he drew a crucial, almost paradoxical conclusion, that while the existing technology, like the machine gun, had caused the trench stalemate, new technology, specifically the airplane, offered the only viable strategic way to end it.
It was a very clean, revolutionary concept for him.
It was. The airplane, being inherently three-dimensional, was the only instrument that could overcome the fundamental problem of continuous fronts and prolonged attrition. It bypassed the entire deadlock.
And from this observation, his core, uncompromising thesis emerged, which he details so thoroughly in Command of the Air.
The absolute necessity of obtaining the command of the air.
He didn't just want air power, he wanted air supremacy. He was making the very airspace above the battlefield and the nation a whole new domain of conflict.
And this required institutional independence. Douhet argued, passionately, for an independent air force, one distinct and separate from the Army and the Navy.
His reasoning was just uncompromising on this.
Totally. If the air arm was merely an auxiliary to the surface forces, its ability to win the war quickly and decisively would be, in his view, tragically constrained.
And he detailed that this independent air arm's primary mission must be singular and absolute. Conquer the command of the air first. He insisted that to be unprepared for this struggle would be just utter foolhardiness.
And here is the punchline that drives his entire theory, which is so critical to understanding the later bombing campaigns of the Second World War.
Right.
Once that conquest was achieved, the subsequent attacks, the actual bombing of the enemy nation, could proceed, and this is his phrase, with impunity over any point of the enemy's body.
That concept of operating with impunity is so central. Douhet believed that the air arm, once it was supreme, was the only instrument that could effectively destroy the enemy's material and moral resistance.
Winning the war, regardless of the current circumstances on the surface.
Yeah, the ground troops just had to hold the line until the air arm could deliver the knockout blow.
It was a truly radical vision for its time. especially because the technology was still so nascent. Douhet insisted on a stabilized armament for this independent force, composed primarily of heavy bombing and supporting combat planes.
He even had this idea that in a crisis, civilian planes could be easily converted into bombing planes.
Yeah, just by substituting bombs for the weight of passengers, cargo, and mail. Which, that spoke less to the technical reality and more to his belief in the inherent decisive nature of the bombing mission itself, regardless of the vehicle.
And his vision of the future was, in retrospect, frighteningly prescient in some ways, especially about the scale of destruction.
Oh, absolutely. He foresaw the coupling of high-explosive bombing with chemical and bacteriological warfare.
He wrote explicitly that air power made it possible to ravage his whole country.
And he linked this, chillingly, to the general, harsh principle that in war, every convention loses its value.
This is the definitive theoretical transition from a localized battlefield conflict where soldiers fight soldiers to total war against a nation-state,
where the entire population becomes a target system. However, as Faber notes in his analysis, even Douhet understood aircraft couldn't strike everything. He had to focus his resources for maximum effect.
Right. If you're going after the entire country, you still need to find the critical vulnerabilities, what he called the vital centers.
Exactly. And he identified 5 basic target systems as the vital centers of a modern country. First, industry, particularly war production.
Makes sense.
Second, transportation infrastructure, so railroads and ports. Third, communication nodes, command and control. Fourth, government buildings, the seat of power.
And the 5th one was the most decisive in his mind.
Right, the will of the people. Attacking these, he believed, would destroy the nation's capacity and its desire to fight simultaneously.
Yet, for all his revolutionary insight into the potential of air power, Douhet gets critiqued, and rightfully so, for his profound technological optimism.
Yes.
Specifically regarding the delivery of that potential. Faber points out that Douhet postulated absurdly uniform and effective bombing.
He basically assumed no duds, no misses, clear weather, flawless performance from pilots and equipment. It's as if his bombers were precision missiles from the future.
It was an extremely mechanistic, almost utopian view of technology. I mean, think about the era, the 1920s.
Yeah. Bombing accuracy was measured in hundreds of meters, not feet. Yet he stated that a target 500 meters in diameter would require only 10 aircraft to be destroyed entirely.
That assumption just dramatically simplified the technical challenges of the era?
It did. And those are challenges that would plague bombing campaigns for decades. Douhet often seemed to be predicting the results of technology decades later, not describing the true, often dismal capabilities of his own time.
So conceptually, he's light years ahead, but technically, he's operating on a lot of faith.
A lot of faith. And perhaps the most fatal theoretical flaw in his early work was how he treated the actual battle for air superiority.
He kind of just skips over it.
He virtually ignored the fight required for the command of the air. He believed the inherent attributes of the airplane's speed, altitude, and range granted this overwhelming tactical surprise, allowing command to be achieved without a fight.
In his fictional War of 19-something, the entire air battle is over in, 3 hours?
A mere 3 hours.
That seems wildly optimistic, even fanatical, especially given the rapid improvements in fighter aircraft and anti-aircraft artillery after the First World War.
Absolutely.
Did his critics immediately seize on that weakness? That tension between annihilation, the quick, decisive strikes on the homeland, and the grinding attrition of a real air superiority fight?
Oh, immediately. Critics pointed out that assuming speed and altitude alone grant you impunity is just dangerous. They saw air superiority not as a sudden 3-hour event, but as this dynamic process that had to be continuously contested and maintained.
So it would require fighter escort, robust defenses, significant losses.
Exactly. This tension between pure, unescorted strategic bombing and the necessity of actually controlling the air would define every single doctrinal debate that followed.
Okay, so let's move across the Atlantic. How did these radical Italian ideas translate and evolve in the United States? And the key figure here, of course, is William Mitchell.
Billy Mitchell. He became the leading and certainly the loudest and most controversial advocate for air power in the United States.
His background was a bit different from Douhet's, right? Less theoretical.
Much less. He was more of an operational advocate, an institutional warrior. But, like Douhet, Mitchell insisted that air power's influence would be decisively strategic. He stressed that an independent air force could bypass surface forces entirely and attack those vital centers.
He really drove the point home that the purpose of air power was not to assist the Army or the Navy directly.
No, that was ancillary.
The real purpose was to destroy the nation's capacity to wage war. And he explicitly defined the essence of that capacity, not as its uniformed forces, but its industrial and agricultural underpinnings.
That focus on the economy was key to American thinking. Mitchell equated the will of a nation to the will of its populace. He envisioned air power wreaking such havoc from destroying industrial production to interfering with cultivation and cutting off water supplies.
That the enemy populace would lose their desire to continue the fight, forcing the government to surrender.
Exactly. But what's fascinating, and Faber points this out, is Mitchell's very public vacillation on the morality of targeting civilians.
He was trying to push the boundaries, but still occasionally had to pay lip service to the ethical norms of the time.
Right. On one hand, he advocated for the Douhetist approach, calling for attacks on places where people live to discourage their desire to renew the combat.
But then in his own bombing manual in 1922, he completely contradicts that.
He does. He argues that attacking a factory was only ethical if the workers received sufficient warning that the center will be destroyed. It shows this deep internal conflict between the radical goal of breaking national will through shock and some remaining vestige of conventional ethics about non-combatants.
This brings us to the most important institutional incubator of American doctrine, the Air Corps Tactical School.
ACTS. The Air Corps Tactical School was the intellectual engine. While several organizations contributed to American air doctrine in the interwar years, some conservative, some moderate, the most important, and certainly the most radical in its conceptual development, was the Air Corps Tactical School.
And they became the driving force behind the concept of unescorted, high-altitude precision daylight bombing.
They did. They sought to take Douhet's broad, radical vision and refine it into a precise, objective methodology, something that could actually be taught and executed.
Okay, so what did that look like?
They developed what became known as the industrial web theory. This was an economy of force doctrine predicated on a meticulous, objective analysis of the enemy economy.
So the idea was to move past the simple, destructive notion of just area bombing.
Precisely. It was about identifying critical nodes within that industrial web.
So instead of trying to hit the whole body, you aim for a single necessary component. What kind of targets did they identify?
They moved from generalized categories to specific system-critical choke points. They realized you didn't need to obliterate everything. If you took out a few key systems, for instance, the facilities producing ball bearings, which are essential for every piece of rotating machinery,
Right.
or key electrical power generation facilities or synthetic petroleum refining capacity, the whole industrial machine would seize up.
So it's neutralization through systemic failure, not just annihilation.
That's the perfect way to put it.
So if Douhet said, hit the head to destroy the will, the Air Corps Tactical School said, hit the nervous system, and the head won't be able to communicate with the body.
Exactly. It's about system paralysis, a much more clinical approach than wholesale destruction. They aimed for neutralization rather than annihilation.
But this core doctrine of unescorted bombardment, this belief that the bomber, thanks to its speed and high altitude, was fast and resilient enough to penetrate defenses alone, that was hotly debated, right? Even within their own ranks.
Oh, it was a massive, possibly fatal gamble to base an entire doctrine on.
Seems like it.
It was. Faber reveals that other officers urged caution, arguing that this doctrine had not been established as being true and might even be fatally dangerous.
And the danger lay in that doctrinal rigidity. If a war proved that bombers couldn't survive unescorted,
Entire formations would be wiped out before they even reached their target, potentially costing the Air Force its viability. This shows that American airmen, while they inherited Douhet's enthusiasm for the strategic mission, were actively wrestling with the enormous, terrifying gap between the theoretical vision and the technical reality of their aircraft.
So air power theory was definitely not monolithic across the globe in the interwar period. I mean, while Mitchell and the Air Corps Tactical School were refining strategic precision, Europe was following really divergent paths.
And surface forces were mounting significant intellectual and institutional resistance.
We need to look at these divergences to really understand why the Second World War bombing campaigns varied so much from country to country.
Let's start with Great Britain and Sir Hugh Trenchard. Trenchard was a foundational figure in the Royal Air Force, the first independent air force in the world.
So, like Douhet, he recognized the essentiality of air superiority first.
Step one, absolutely. often achieved by attacking enemy airfields.
But beyond that initial conquest, his focus was different than Douhet's pure strategic focus.
Significantly different. Trenchard was far less focused on the purely independent strike. He stressed that air operations must be conducted in conjunction with the ground effort.
Okay, so what did that mean in practice?
His primary operational focus shifted pretty quickly to interdiction targets, things like railroad marshalling yards, bridges, supply depots targets that directly supported the fragile British armies on the continent.
So he clearly saw the air arm as inseparable from the operations of the army as a whole. It's about timing and coordinating bombing to produce maximum effect on the enemy's ability to supply the front line.
It was integrated warfare, long before the modern concept of joint operations.
And Trenchard tried to walk a very difficult, almost impossible moral and psychological line, particularly regarding population centers.
He did. He vehemently rejected claims that the Royal Air Force was intent on population bombing, explicitly calling terror bombing illegitimate.
But he did still target things in populated areas, didn't he? How did he justify that?
He defended attacking legitimate military objectives, factories, depots, rail links, even if they were located in highly populated areas. The stated rationale was to terrorize munitions workers into absenteeism,
So the intent officially was not to kill the non-combatants.
but to use the fear of attack on their workplace to disrupt production schedules. It was an early, subtle embrace of psychological pressure, an attempt to break the moral resistance of the workers without explicitly declaring war on the general populace,
A very fine distinction.
a distinction that proved incredibly fragile in practice.
Meanwhile, Germany, which was denied an air force by the Versailles Treaty, still maintained an intellectual tradition of centralized air command from the First World War.
That's right. So when they rebuilt their air capability, they had a strong foundation to build on.
How did they approach doctrine?
That tradition, combined with a strong culture of objective analysis and a focus on speed, which, led to the Blitzkrieg ground concept, led the reborn Luftwaffe in the 1930s to develop what Faber calls a sophisticated, broad-gauge doctrine. They were practical, not purist.
What did that broad-gauge approach look like?
Well, while they certainly stressed the primacy and importance of strategic bombardment, they crucially did not neglect the importance of tactical support for the armies. They developed both medium bombers for strategic strikes and highly effective dive bombers for close air support and interdiction.
So they sought flexibility and capability across the entire spectrum of conflict, not the rigid independence Douhet demanded.
Exactly. And that flexibility would be key to their early successes in Poland and France.
And in stark contrast to that German dynamism, the French doctrine after World War I suffered from what Faber calls psychic paralysis.
Yeah, stemming from the absolute horrors of the trenches they had just endured.
The sheer scale of casualties had led France to adopt an overwhelmingly defensive strategic posture.
The Maginot Line mentality. They showed very little confidence in the Air Force beyond basic support and reconnaissance. Their revised 1936 doctrine was highly restrictive, emphasizing the improbability of achieving air superiority except for limited periods on the front lines.
That defensive, constrained conceptual development greatly limited their ability to employ the airplane as a decisive offensive weapon when the war actually started.
It's a fascinating example of how national psychological trauma can translate so directly into limiting military doctrine.
And the Douhet doctrine faced direct opposition from within his own country, Italy, right?
It did. Captain Amedeo Micazzi, another Italian theorist, systematically refuted Douhet's maximalist theses. He found Douhet's fixation on independence and pure strategic bombing to be strategically myopic.
What did Micazzi advocate for instead?
He advocated for the primacy of assault aviation, which means close air support and battlefield interdiction, aircraft designed to directly affect the ground battle. He argued that aviation was inherently joint.
So he emphasized the need for an air reserve for use during critical moments of the ground battle.
Exactly. His focus was on tactical integration and mission flexibility, directly countering Douhet's focus on bombing the homeland above all else. And that argument for Jonas would prove highly influential later on.
It seems naval forces were perhaps the most consistently skeptical audience for the independent air power proponents like Mitchell.
Oh, absolutely. Naval officers, particularly in the United States, viewed aircraft strictly as auxiliary, a tool of the fleet. They recognized the acute need for air superiority over the fleet to protect their battleships, but they saw little strategic role for independent air forces operating thousands of miles inland.
This is where William Mitchell's institutional fights really came to a head, especially concerning the aircraft carrier.
Mitchell spent years aggressively denigrating aircraft carriers, portraying them as expensive, vulnerable, and ineffective targets compared to land-based strategic bombers.
But Faber notes that this effort ironically backfired on him.
It did. Mitchell's aggressive critique gave a healthy boost to naval aviation by alerting the Admiralty to the absolute need for air superiority to protect their capital ships. Mitchell's relentless attacks ultimately accelerated naval aviation's integration and development rather than eliminating it.
Which just goes to show that even failure can drive progress in military thinking.
Exactly.
We've discussed the theory, the doctrine, the institutional resistance, but now we must grapple with the profound moral consequences of these doctrines. Douhet and Mitchell spoke so abstractly of destroying the enemy's moral resistance.
Right.
How did the reality of long-range aerial warfare affect the people who carried it out and the people who were targeted? This is heavy material, but it's crucial for understanding modern war.
This is where the analysis in Jonathan Glover's Humanity, a moral history of the 20th century, becomes absolutely essential. The core issue, Glover argues, is the psychology of distance. When war is conducted at a distance, a physical and psychological separation enabled by the altitude and speed of the airplane, the normal human inhibitions linked to sympathy and respect are fundamentally neutralized.
You don't have to look the enemy in the eye. The suffering, the humiliation, the sheer human cost is simply not visible or tangible to the aggressor.
Precisely. The emotional release or the shared physical peril of close combat is absent. This means the attacker's moral resources, those internal barriers we erect to prevent ourselves from inflicting pain, are not threatened by the immediate horrible reality of what they're doing.
They're attacking dots on a map or industrial systems, not individual human beings.
Right. And Glover captures this chillingly with a personal account from a Royal Air Force bomber pilot during a raid on Duisburg in 1943, where the destruction was just immense.
What did he say?
The pilot stated very candidly, "I had little difficulty in banishing the human victims from my mind," linking this directly to the physical distance and the altitude of the attack.
So distance is profoundly dehumanizing for the victim and dangerously morally neutralizing for the perpetrator.
The physical separation allowed for the cognitive separation needed to carry out mass destruction.
And the history of strategic bombing, as traced in Humanity, is characterized as a moral slide. The intentional targeting of civilians became acceptable not through a sudden policy change, but through these incremental steps.
Each one building on the moral precedent set by the last. The slide began, arguably, with the naval blockade during the First World War. This systemic, distant, politically justified starvation of a population, while not involving bombs, demonstrated the acceptability of inflicting widespread civilian suffering for strategic ends.
So that precedent made military bombing more palatable.
And from there, the moral distance closed rapidly during the Second World War. Military bombing of specific targets gradually slid into area bombing, exemplified tragically by raids like the firebombing of Hamburg.
Which specifically targeted population centers not just to destroy factories, but to shatter civilian morale.
It established a new horrific precedent, which in turn made the firebombing of Japanese wooded cities acceptable on a massive scale. And that process ultimately allowed the final horrific slide to the atomic bomb. Each step created a new moral boundary that had already been psychologically crossed.
And in this devastating moral slide, Douhet's radical vision, once dismissed as fanatical, was tragically realized in 1945.
Glover specifically notes that with the advent of the atomic bomb, air power had finally caught up with Douhet's imagination.
Because a single nuclear weapon could inflict destruction comparable to a massive conventional raid involving hundreds of heavy bombers, but instantly.
It achieved the decisive, immediate annihilation Douhet had always promised, finally overcoming the technical limitations that had hampered air power for decades.
And the decision-making process around using the atomic bomb itself highlights this complex ethical intersection. The committee considered alternatives, like a harmless demonstration, but ultimately rejected them.
The rejection was based on a calculated risk assessment. They worried the Japanese might suspect the demonstration was a trick, or they might attack the delivery aircraft, or, crucially, that the bomb might not work.
Or might not be impressive enough to stop the war.
Right. The goal had shifted so entirely to achieving total immediate surrender via psychological shock and mass destruction that risking the bomb's shock value was deemed unacceptable. The theoretical goal of breaking the enemy's will just overshadowed the alternatives.
It demonstrates the paradox. Air power promises total victory, but the political outcome often requires more than just destruction.
Later, looking back at conflicts like the Vietnam War's linebacker, two operations, thoughtful analysts noted that while air power can absolutely negate military capability, the final political objective often required the carrot of concessions as much as the stick of air power.
So air power, even at its most destructive, is rarely a panacea for achieving complex political aims unless it's paired with diplomacy and negotiation.
And this moment, the nuclear realization, it permanently shifted air power theory, pivoting away from achieving victory primarily through battlefield annihilation toward strategic concepts aimed at preventing war itself.
After the Second World War and the overwhelming realization of nuclear power, air power theory entered a dramatically new phase.
One dominated by the strategic concept of deterrence. The fundamental mission of the air arm shifted from winning wars to preventing them.
And deterrence is the idea that states won't attack if the expected costs of attacking, resulting from retaliation, outweigh the expected benefits of not attacking.
Right, and nuclear weapons profoundly altered this calculus because the potential cost became existential. Strategic air power now provided the capability to inflict assured, massive damage, making security strategies based on punishment and deterrence far more feasible than traditional defense strategies.
The goal was to threaten such catastrophic destruction that the war never starts in the first place.
Exactly. But the technology kept moving rapidly. The advent of intercontinental ballistic missiles, or ICBMs, raised entirely new vulnerability problems, challenging the stability of that deterrence equation.
As the accuracies of those ICBMs increased, and especially with the introduction of multiple independently targetable re-entry vehicles, the fixed silos used to house these missiles became highly vulnerable.
Vulnerable to a preemptive first strike.
Let's quickly detail that mechanism because it's critical. Why did those multiple warheads make fixed silos so much more vulnerable?
Because a single attacking missile carrying multiple warheads could be targeted to destroy multiple fixed enemy silos simultaneously. This drastically worsened the cost-benefit ratio for the side being attacked.
A first strike could theoretically eliminate a massive percentage of the enemy's retaliatory force using relatively few of the attacker's own missiles.
And this threat of preemption threatened the entire deterrence posture. It led to urgent, decades-long debates about ICBM survivability and the need for mobile launchers to keep the enemy from knowing the precise locations of the missiles.
And what about air defense? Douhet's original prediction, later echoed by politician Stanley Baldwin, that the bombers would always get through.
That continued to drive a relentless technological arms race. It became a constant back and forth between offensive and defensive technologies.
So the defensive side developed sophisticated surface-to-air missiles, interceptors, complex ground-based radar systems.
And the offensive side responded with aggressive countermeasures, including electronic warfare jamming and spoofing standoff weapons and low-level flight profiles to evade radar.
This long process ultimately culminated in the research and deployment of stealth technology.
All designed to reduce an aircraft's visibility to sensors. Getting even a low percentage of successful penetrations remained critical because of the nuclear payloads involved.
By the 1980s, the focus shifted back, not away from nuclear deterrence entirely, but toward conventional high-intensity conflict in Europe. This led to the development of the airland battle doctrine,
which was a response to the massive conventional threat posed by the Soviet Union. Airland battle was a significant intellectual development because it was fundamentally a joint doctrine, emphasizing a strong mandatory partnership between the Army and the Air Force.
And the focus was on the deep battle concept.
Right, and the deep battle concept was designed to prevent the enemy from overwhelming NATO forces at the point of contact.
So the imperative was to deny the enemy the ability to concentrate combat power.
By attacking follow-on forces in depth, often 3 to 4 days out from the front lines. The Air Force's role was crucial for deep interdiction, coordinating strikes on enemy reserves, supply columns, and command posts, alongside the Army's own deep fire systems.
The overall goal was increasing the tempo of warfare to create opportunities for ground forces to maneuver.
And this concept was then carried forward and refined by modern strategic thinkers like Colonel John Worden III, who sought to update the strategic bombing tradition for the era of precision-guided munitions.
Worden's work is a direct conceptual descendant of Douhet, but adapted to modern system theory.
Yes. Worden focused on achieving what he called strategic paralysis, by viewing the enemy not as a series of disconnected targets, but as an interdependent system. He famously modeled this system as 5 concentric rings.
Let's name those rings because they really encapsulate modern strategic targeting philosophy.
They start from the center and move outward. The core is leadership.
The decision makers.
The second ring is system essentials, things like power grids and telecommunications. The third is infrastructure, roads, rail lines, airports. The fourth is population, and the final outermost ring is the fielded forces.
The traditional armies, navies, and air forces.
Exactly.
And the goal is to hit the center, not the periphery.
Precisely. The ultimate overarching goal of strategic air power, in this view, is changing the mind of the enemy leadership, which is the center ring. This is achieved either directly by attacking command posts or indirectly through what's called control warfare.
Control war.
Which means disrupting the ability of the leadership to command their own system. You are attacking the system of governance and information processing, not just the physical infrastructure or the armies.
And this emphasis on controlling the system ties directly into the seminal work of Colonel John Boyd and his famous decision-making model.
Absolutely. Worden's control concept is intrinsically linked to Boyd's Observe, Orient, Decide Act loop, or OODA loop. Boyd argued that victory is achieved not by possessing superior numbers, but by gaining a temporal advantage over the opponent.
How does that temporal advantage work within the ODA loop?
The loop involves 4 sequential steps: observe, gathering intelligence; orient, analyzing that information within your cultural and mental models; decide, forming a course of action; and act, executing the decision.
And Worden's attacks, targeting the enemy's system essentials, they disrupt the enemy's ODA loop.
Particularly the orient phase, which is the most critical and vulnerable.
So, if you disrupt their ability to orient, to make sense of the chaos and synthesize new information, you produce a psychological paralysis of their decision-making process.
They simply can't react effectively. You don't necessarily need to destroy them outright, you just paralyze their ability to react quickly and effectively. They're acting based on yesterday's information, while you are already moving into tomorrow's plans.
Which naturally leads us to the most modern expression of air power and control warfare, the concept of information dominance.
Future warfare, as we see evolving today, is increasingly focused on controlling the data sphere, integrating all technologies, command, control, communications, computers, and intelligence, to maintain absolute orientation while completely disorienting the enemy. Information dominance provides the means to achieve that rapid temporal advantage required to execute strategic paralysis.
Fundamentally ensuring the means for victory, without necessarily engaging in prolonged ground attrition.
As we conclude this deep dive, what really stands out is the troubled, erratic, yet relentlessly forward-moving development of air power theory. It was a theoretical structure often built on hope and profound technological anticipation, rather than current reality.
Yeah, from Douhet's radical insistence on independence, built on technology that hadn't yet arrived, to the highly complex, joint, control-oriented concepts of modern conflict, the journey was anything but straight.
The early claims of visionaries like Douhet and Michel often made these sweeping promises for air power that reached far beyond the then available technology.
Those unescorted bombers surviving everything, the instantaneous destruction of a nation's will.
Right, and this understandably fueled deep skepticism in traditionally conservative military circles, which had centuries of surface warfare history informing their doctrine. Yet the airmen kept pushing, ultimately forcing the integration of the air domain into every facet of strategic thought.
So the core learning objective here is understanding that theoretical evolution. It's about tracing air power from an auxiliary function, a simple reconnaissance device, to a decisive, independent force focused on strategic annihilation.
And ultimately to a controlling factor in warfare focused on strategic systems, leadership minds, and information dominance.
Now we come to our final provocative thought for you to consider, blending the technological and the moral lessons of this deep dive. We noted that the historical shift toward air power enabled a new level of physical distance in conflict, which Jonathan Glover argued neutralizes many moral inhibitions.
Right.
Given that contemporary strategy, particularly control warfare and information dominance, seeks to achieve an even greater distance, not physical but cognitive distance, paralyzing the enemy's decision-making loop, how should contemporary strategists balance the efficiency and speed of strategic paralysis with the imperative to maintain a moral framework for warfare?
Especially when the target often remains the enemy's entire system of control, which inherently relies on the populace for its infrastructure and communication.
The ultimate question remains, does increasing technical sophistication and the cognitive distance it affords inevitably lead to decreasing moral restraint? continuing the moral slide of the 20th century into the 21st.
It's a deep and urgent question for any student of modern doctrine.
Thank you for joining us for this doctrine deep dive into the evolution of air power theory.